Before we dive into one of the most impossible naval battles ever fought, let me ask you something. What would you do if your entire career was destroyed by lies? If you were tortured, stripped of command, and watched helplessly as everything you built was torn apart by incompetence and jealousy, and then, when your nation was on the verge of annihilation, they came back to you, not with an apology, not with an army, but with 13 ships. 13 broken ships against an armada of 330. Most men would have surrendered. Most men would have fled. Admiral Yi Sun-sin did neither. What happened next in the narrow waters of Myeongnyang Strait wasn't just a battle. It was a masterpiece of tactical genius, raw courage, and the cold calculation of a man who refused to lose. This is the story of how one man, abandoned by his own government, betrayed by his rivals, and outnumbered 25-1, turned geography and timing into weapons sharper than any sword. No fluff, no exaggeration. Just the facts, the strategy, and the impossible victory that changed the course of a war. If this story moves you, if you learn something new today, here's what I need. Hit that like button, drop a comment, subscribe if you haven't already. We're building something here, a community that values real history told without compromise. Now let's go back to 1597, to the southern coast of Korea, where everything was falling apart. The Imjin War had been raging for 5 years. In 1592, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the man who unified Japan, launched an invasion of Korea with one ultimate goal: conquer Ming China. Korea was just the road. The Japanese brought 158,000 men in the first wave alone. Samurai, arquebusiers, siege engineers. They stormed through the southern ports and pushed north with terrifying speed. Within weeks, Seoul fell. Within months, they were at the gates of Pyongyang, but they made one critical mistake. They underestimated the Korean Navy, and they underestimated the man commanding it. Admiral Yi Sun-sin was not a typical officer. He was 47 years old when the war began, older than most field commanders, and he had spent his career being overlooked, demoted, and politically sidelined. He was blunt, uncompromising, refused to play court politics. That made him enemies, powerful enemies. But when the Japanese invasion fleet tried to control the sea routes that supplied their armies on land, he shattered them. At the Battle of Hansan Island in 1592, he commanded a fleet of Panaxian warships, Korea's legendary turtle ships, and he used a tactic called the crane wing formation. He lured the Japanese fleet into open water, then enveloped them from 3 sides. Of the 73 Japanese ships that entered the battle, 59 were destroyed. It was a slaughter. The Japanese never recovered control of the western sea routes. Their northern advance stalled. Their supply lines were choked. Yi Sun-sin had turned the tide of the war from the deck of a ship. For 4 years, he won battle after battle. He never lost a naval engagement. Not one. His record was perfect. 23 victories, 0 defeats. The Japanese feared him. His own men revered him. But in the royal court in Seoul, jealousy festered. He had powerful rivals. Chief among them was Won Jaehyun, another admiral who hated Yi's prominence and success. Won Jaehyun whispered in the right ears, made alliances with court officials who resented Yi's bluntness and independence. In 1597, Japanese spies fed false intelligence to the Korean court. They claimed a Japanese general named Kato Kiyomasa would be sailing with a small fleet near Busan, vulnerable to ambush. The message was intentionally leaked. It was bait. The Korean king Seonjo ordered Yi to attack. Yi refused. He knew it was a trap. The geography didn't make sense. The timing was wrong. Kato Kiyomasa wouldn't expose himself like that. He sent a message back to the court. He would not sacrifice his fleet on a fool's errand. The refusal was seen as insubordination. His enemies pounced. Won Jaehyun accused him of cowardice, of treasonous defiance. The king, isolated and paranoid in a wartime capital, sided against Yi. In April 1597, Yi Sun-sin was arrested. He was stripped of his rank, dragged to Seoul in chains, and tortured. They wanted a confession. They wanted him to admit he had sabotaged the war effort, that he was a traitor. He refused to confess because there was nothing to confess. He had committed no crime except being right when powerful men wanted him to be wrong. Yi Sun-sin should have been executed. The sentence was prepared, but a few voices in the court intervened. His record was undeniable. His victories had saved Korea. Executing him would be madness, so instead they humiliated him. He was demoted to the rank of common soldier and sent to serve in the army under General Guan Yul. He went from commanding the entire Southern Fleet to carrying a spear in the infantry. The greatest naval commander Korea had ever produced was now a foot soldier. Won Jaeon took command of the Korean Navy. He had what he wanted. He had his fleet, his ships, his men. He had everything except his skill, his discipline, and his strategic mind. Won Jaeon was arrogant and reckless. He believed the Japanese were weak, that his caution had been unnecessary. In July 1597, Won Jaeon led the Korean fleet into battle at Chilchonryang. He ignored the reports. He ignored the warnings. He sailed directly into a Japanese ambush. The Japanese fleet was waiting. Over 500 ships surrounded Won Jaeon's force. The Koreans had no room to maneuver, no time to form up. It was chaos. The Japanese closed in and butchered them. Ship after ship burned or sank. Men drowned screaming in the water. Soldiers leapt overboard to escape the flames and were cut down by Japanese arrows and musket fire. Won Jaeon himself was killed, struck down trying to flee. Of the 166 Korean ships that entered the battle, only 12 survived. 12. The Korean Navy, the force that had held the Japanese at bay for 5 years, was annihilated in a single afternoon. The southern coast was wide open. Japanese forces poured ashore, resupplied and reinforced by sea. They began advancing north again, burning villages, slaughtering civilians. Panic spread through the Korean court. The war they thought they were winning was suddenly, catastrophically, slipping away. In August 1597, King Seonjo did the only thing he could do. He reinstated Admiral Yi Sun-sin. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the injustice. Just a terse order: take command of the Navy and stop the Japanese. When he arrived at the naval base in Hansan, there was almost nothing left. The proud fleet he had built and commanded was gone. The shipyards were abandoned. Morale was shattered. He sent messages to rally the surviving ships and sailors. Slowly they came. Damaged vessels limped into port. Deserters returned. By mid-September, he had assembled what remained of Korea's southern fleet, 13 ships. That was it. 13 Panaxian warships in various states of disrepair. Some had broken oars. Others had torn sails. Supplies were almost non-existent. Cannons were in short supply. Many of the sailors were inexperienced, survivors from other ships or conscripts who had never been in a real battle. This was what Yi Sun-sin had to work with. 13 ships to face the Japanese Navy, which now controlled the southern seas with over 300 vessels. The strategic situation was worse than grim. It was hopeless. The court in Seoul sent Yi another message. It was a suggestion, carefully worded but clear in its meaning: disband the Navy. Scatter the ships, send the men to join the army. Naval resistance was no longer feasible. He read the message and wrote back one of the most famous replies in Korean history: I still have 12 warships. As long as I am alive, the enemy will never be safe. 12, he had lost one more ship since his last count, but his response was not bravado, it was calculation. He knew something the court didn't. He knew the Japanese would come for him. They had destroyed the Korean fleet. Now they wanted to eliminate the last remnants and secure their sea routes permanently, and he knew exactly where they would come. He had been studying the southern coast for 5 years. He knew every island, every current, every narrow passage. If the Japanese wanted him, they would have to come through Myeongnyang Strait. Myeongnyang is a narrow channel between the southwestern tip of the Korean mainland and Jindo Island. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 300 meters wide. The water flows through it like a river, fast and treacherous. But here's what makes Myeongnyang unique: the current reverses. Tides in the Yellow Sea are extreme, and when the tide changes, the current in the strait doesn't just slow down. It stops, then flows in the opposite direction with violent force. The current can reach speeds of over 11 knots. In the age of sail and oar, that was faster than most ships could row against. He understood this. If he could lure the Japanese fleet into the strait at the right moment, their numbers would mean nothing. In those narrow, churning waters, they couldn't deploy their full force. They would have to come at him in a column, a few ships at a time. Their advantage would vanish. Geography would become his weapon, timing would be everything. But first, he had to make sure the Japanese would take the bait. He spent the days before the battle preparing his men and his ships. He knew morale was fragile. Many of his sailors believed they were already dead. They had watched their comrades die at Chilchonryang. They had seen the might of the Japanese fleet. Now they were being asked to face that same enemy with 13 ships. He gathered his officers and spoke to them plainly. He told them that running would mean certain death. Scattered ships would be hunted down one by one, but if they stood together, if they fought in the right place at the right time, they could win, not just survive. Win. Some of his officers didn't believe him. One captain, Kim Eok-chu, was openly terrified. During the battle, his ship would hang back, refusing to advance. You would later have him executed for cowardice, but most of the men, despite their fear, trusted Yi. They had heard the stories of Hansen Island, of Yi's undefeated record. If any man could pull off a miracle, it was him. He also studied the geography obsessively. He sent scouts to measure the current at different times of day. He noted the exact moment when the tide would turn. He positioned lookouts on the cliffs overlooking the strait to watch for the Japanese approach. Every detail mattered. One mistake, one miscalculation, and his entire fleet would be destroyed. On October 25, 1597, the Japanese fleet set sail from their base near Busan. They had intelligence that he was nearby with a pitifully small force. The Japanese commander, Kirishima Michifusa, led the vanguard with around 133 warships. Behind him, Todo Takatora commanded another 200 ships. In total, the Japanese armada numbered at least 330 vessels, possibly more. They were confident, aggressive, hunting for his last ships like wolves closing in on wounded prey. Kirishima Michifusa was a veteran naval commander. He had fought in numerous battles during the Imjin War and had earned a reputation for aggression and tactical skill. He was also ambitious. Destroying Yi's remaining ships would bring him glory and favor with Hideyoshi. He pushed his fleet hard, eager to close the distance and finish the Korean Navy once and for all. He positioned his 13 ships at the mouth of Myeongnyang Strait on the morning of October 26. He knew the Japanese scouts would spot him. He wanted them to. When the Japanese saw 13 Korean ships sitting in open water, they must have thought it was a gift. Kirishima ordered an immediate attack. The Japanese fleet surged forward, sails filled, oars churned the water. Hundreds of ships bearing down on 13. His officers were terrified. They could see the Japanese fleet approaching, an endless line of ships stretching back to the horizon. Some of them begged Yi to retreat. They could run, scatter, try to survive. He refused. He ordered the ships to hold position. He stood on the deck of his flagship, calm and unmoved, watching the Japanese approach. His men looked to him. If their admiral was not afraid, perhaps they could find courage too. The Japanese kept coming. The distance closed, 1,000 meters. 800, 500. The Japanese were so close now that his men could see individual soldiers on the decks, samurai preparing to board, archers knocking arrows. The sound of drums and war cries carried across the water. It looked like the end of the world. And then Yi gave the order. He turned his flagship, a heavy Panaxian, directly toward the Japanese vanguard and advanced. Alone, his other 12 ships hesitated. His flagship surged forward into the face of 330 enemy vessels, and for a moment, it looked like suicide. But Yi knew exactly what he was doing. The current in Myeongnyang Strait was still flowing out toward the open sea. It was strong, pushing against the Japanese ships trying to enter the channel. Yi's ship, moving with the current, had speed and momentum. The Japanese ships, fighting against it, were sluggish and slow to maneuver. Yi's flagship opened fire. Korean cannons roared. Iron balls and exploding projectiles slammed into the lead Japanese ships. The Korean cannons were different from Japanese guns. They had longer range and greater stopping power. The Panaxian warships were also built differently. They had higher sides, making them difficult to board. They were essentially floating gun platforms designed for long-range combat. The Japanese preferred close combat, boarding actions, hand-to-hand fighting. His strategy was to keep them at a distance and pound them with artillery. The Japanese vanguard tried to close in, to grapple and board, but his ship was faster, more maneuverable. He turned, fired broadsides, turned again. The Japanese ships collided with each other trying to pursue him in the narrow waters. The current was already causing problems. Ships that tried to turn too sharply were caught by the flow and pushed off course. Oars snapped, rudders strained. The Japanese captains realized too late that they were fighting not just his ships, but the sea itself. More Korean ships finally joined the attack. Seeing their admiral advance alone had shamed them into action. Even Kim Eok-chu, the terrified captain, moved his ship forward, though he stayed at the rear of the formation. The Korean fleet formed a line and opened fire, 13 ships against hundreds. But the Japanese couldn't bring their numbers to bear. The strait was too narrow. Only a dozen or so Japanese ships could engage at a time. The rest were bottled up behind, unable to maneuver, slamming into each other in the current. The fighting was brutal and close. Japanese ships pressed forward, ramming attempts, archer volleys, musket fire crackling across the water. One of his ships took heavy damage, its hull breached by a ramming attack. The crew fought desperately to plug the leak while continuing to fire their cannons. Another Korean ship was nearly boarded when a Japanese vessel managed to close the distance. Korean sailors fought hand-to-hand on the deck, pushing the attackers back into the sea. Yi himself was hit by a musket ball. It grazed his left shoulder, tearing through the fabric of his armor. Blood ran down his arm. His officers shouted for him to take cover, to let the ship's surgeon tend the wound. He ignored them. He stayed on the command deck, shouting orders, directing the fire of the cannons, watching the movements of the Japanese fleet. There was no time for pain, no time for weakness. His men needed to see him standing, but he wasn't trying to win yet. He was buying time. He needed to hold the Japanese in the strait until the tide turned. Every minute mattered. His cannons fired again and again. Gun crews worked in brutal rhythm, loading, aiming, firing, reloading. The decks were thick with smoke and the stench of gunpowder. Cannonballs splashed into the water or crashed into Japanese hulls. Some ships caught fire. Others took on water and began to list. The Japanese were frustrated. They had overwhelming numbers, but they couldn't use them. Kurashima Michifusa, commanding the vanguard, was enraged. He had expected an easy slaughter. Instead, he was losing ships. His men were dying, and the Korean admiral was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to break. Kurashima pushed his flagship forward, trying to break through Yi's line and force a decisive engagement. He was determined to kill Yi personally if necessary. Then the tide changed. Yi felt it first. The current slowed, stopped, hesitated for a moment like the world holding its breath. Then it reversed. Now the water was flowing into the strait toward the Japanese. The Korean ships, positioned perfectly at the mouth of the channel, could now advance with the current behind them. The Japanese, who had been pushing forward, were suddenly fighting against the flow. Their ships lost speed. Their formations broke apart. Chaos spread through the Japanese line. He attacked. He gave the order, and all 13 Korean ships drove forward in a coordinated assault. The current pushed them like a hand at their backs. Cannons fired at point-blank range. Korean archers unleashed volleys of arrows. Fire arrows streaked through the air and landed on Japanese decks, igniting sails and rigging. The lead Japanese ships, trapped in the narrow channel and unable to retreat, were torn apart. Kurashima's flagship took multiple hits. A cannonball smashed through the stern, killing half a dozen men and destroying the rudder. Another shot punched through the hull below the waterline. Water poured in. Fire broke out on the deck, fed by the wind and the tar used to waterproof the ship. Kurashima stood on the command deck, screaming orders, trying to rally his men. Then a Korean arrow or projectile struck him. Accounts vary on the exact weapon. Some say it was an arrow. Others claim it was a stone or iron ball from a Korean cannon. Either way, Kirishima Michifusa was killed. His body fell to the deck. His flagship, burning and taking on water, drifted helplessly in the current and sank. The death of Kirishima broke the Japanese vanguard. Without their commander, panic set in. Ships tried to turn around, but there was no room. They collided with the ships behind them. The captains in the rear didn't know what was happening. They saw the vanguard retreating and assumed the battle was lost. More Korean cannonballs crashed into the Japanese hulls. One ship exploded, its powder magazine ignited by fire. The blast was so powerful that debris rained down on the surrounding vessels. Another ship capsized in the current, its hull rolled by the force of the water and the weight of men scrambling to one side. The narrow waters of Myeongnyang were turning into a killing field. Bodies floated in the current. Burning wreckage drifted past. The sea was thick with blood and oil. Japanese sailors who jumped overboard to escape the fires were swept away by the current or dragged under by their armor and weapons. The Korean ships continued to advance, firing into the mass of retreating Japanese vessels. Todo Takatora, commanding the second wave of the Japanese fleet, saw what was happening and made a critical decision. He was a more experienced and cautious commander than Kirishima. He realized that the battle was unwinnable. The geography and the current had turned the strait into a death trap. Sending more ships forward would only lead to more losses. Takatora ordered a full retreat. The Japanese fleet turned and fled. They abandoned the strait, abandoned their vanguard, abandoned the attack. His 13 ships pursued them for a short distance, firing into the retreating mass. The Korean cannons continued to roar, each shot finding targets in the densely packed Japanese fleet, but he knew better than to overextend. The current would eventually turn again, and if he chased too far, he could be caught in open water where the Japanese numbers would overwhelm him. He ordered his ships to halt and regroup at the mouth of the strait. The battle was over. The Japanese lost at least 31 ships destroyed outright. Dozens more were damaged, some so badly that they would sink before reaching port. Hundreds of Japanese sailors and soldiers drowned in the fast-moving waters of the strait. The exact casualty count is difficult to determine because many bodies were swept out to sea by the current. Korean casualties were minimal. Some ships were damaged, but not one was lost. A few dozen men were killed or wounded, including Yi himself, but the fleet survived. 13 ships had held off 330. It wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. The Korean Navy still existed. Admiral Yi Sun-sin was still fighting. And the Japanese, despite their overwhelming numbers and their earlier success at Chilchonryang, could not control the western sea routes as long as Yi lived. The psychological impact of Myeongnyang was devastating for the Japanese. They had believed the Korean Navy was finished, that the southern coast was theirs to control. He had proven them catastrophically wrong. The defeat shattered Japanese confidence. Commanders who had been eager to engage his fleet now hesitated. Ships that had sailed aggressively through Korean waters now stayed close to shore, wary of ambush. The Japanese Navy had been humiliated. Todo Takatora, who had ordered the retreat, never forgot the battle. Years later, he would write that Yi Sun-sin was the greatest naval commander he had ever faced. He described the Battle of Myeongnyang as a nightmare, a trap that no amount of numbers or bravery could overcome. The Japanese fleet withdrew from the western coast and did not attempt another major assault on the sea routes for the rest of the war. He used the breathing room to rebuild. He gathered more ships, more men, more supplies. Volunteers came from across Korea. Men who had deserted after Chilchonryang returned, shamed by his victory and inspired by his refusal to surrender. Shipwrights worked day and night to repair damaged vessels and build new ones. By the end of 1597, his fleet had grown to over 50 vessels. The navy was alive again, and he was more determined than ever. He spent the winter and spring of 1598 harassing Japanese supply lines. He raided coastal bases, ambushed transport ships, and cut off the flow of food and ammunition to the Japanese armies on land. The Japanese ground forces, which had been advancing north after Chilchenriang, found themselves starving and undersupplied. Their momentum stalled. The war, which had seemed nearly won for Japan, ground to a bloody stalemate. In Japan, Toyotomi Hideyoshi was dying. The invasion of Korea had been his obsession, his grand vision of a Japanese empire stretching to China and beyond. But the war had dragged on for 6 years. It had cost tens of thousands of lives and drained the Japanese economy, and it had failed. Korea had not been conquered, Ming China had not fallen, Hideyoshi's dream was collapsing around him. In September 1598, Hideyoshi died. His successors immediately began planning a withdrawal from Korea. The invasion was over. Orders went out to the Japanese armies: retreat to the southern coastal bases and prepare for evacuation. The Japanese commanders knew it would be dangerous. The Korean Navy, under Yi Sun-sin, controlled the western coast. The withdrawal would have to be conducted carefully, with naval escorts for the transport ships. Yi Sun-sin was not going to let them leave in peace. He had spent 6 years fighting this war. He had been betrayed, tortured, humiliated, and nearly executed. He had watched his country burn and his people suffer. Now the Japanese were retreating, and he intended to make them pay for every mile. In November 1598, he learned that a large Japanese fleet was gathering at the southern ports, preparing to evacuate troops and supplies. He coordinated with the Ming Chinese Navy, which had sent ships to support Korea. Together, they planned a final attack. The target was Myeongnyang Strait, a narrow passage near the southern tip of Korea. If the Japanese wanted to return to Japan, they would have to pass through Myeongnyang. On the night of December 16, 1598, the combined Korean and Ming fleet attacked. Over 150 Allied ships struck the Japanese fleet in the darkness. The Japanese were caught off guard, their ships anchored and unprepared for battle. Fire ships were sent into the Japanese lines, spreading flames and panic. Korean and Chinese cannons opened fire, the muzzle flashes lighting up the night. It was chaos. The Battle of Myeongnyang lasted through the night and into the dawn. The Japanese fought desperately, trying to break through the blockade and escape to open water. Some ships made it, many did not. Over 200 Japanese vessels were destroyed or captured. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors died in the water or on the burning decks. It was the last great naval battle of the Imjin War, and it was a slaughter. But as dawn broke and the Japanese fleet was being destroyed, a stray bullet struck Admiral Yi Sun-sin. It came from a Japanese arquebus, fired from a distance by a soldier who didn't even know who he was shooting at. The bullet hit Yi in the left chest, just below the shoulder. It was a mortal wound. Yi felt it immediately, the hot punch of lead tearing through flesh and bone. He knew he was dying. Yi called his commanders to him. His nephew Yi Won and his officers gathered around. His voice was weak but clear. He gave his final order: "Do not announce my death. The battle is at its height. Beat my war drums, wave my command flags. Do not let the men know I am gone." They understood. If the fleet learned that Yi was dead, morale would collapse. The battle could still be lost. His officers covered his body with a cloak and continued to shout orders in his name. The war drums kept beating. The command flags kept waving. From a distance, the fleet believed Yi was still alive, still commanding. The Korean and Chinese ships pressed the attack and drove the Japanese back. The battle continued for hours. Only after the fighting ended, after the Japanese fleet had been destroyed and the survivors had fled, did Yi's officers reveal that their admiral was dead. The news spread through the fleet like a shockwave. Men who had fought all night without rest collapsed in grief. Sailors wept openly. Commanders stood in stunned silence. Admiral Yi Sun-sin, the man who had never lost a battle, who had saved Korea with 13 ships, who had turned the tide of a war, was gone. He was 53 years old. His body was carried back to his family home. He was given a state funeral. The king, the same king who had ordered his arrest and torture, now heaped honors upon him. He was posthumously promoted to the highest military rank. His family was granted lands and titles, but none of it mattered. He was dead. And Korea had lost its greatest defender. The significance of Admiral Yi Sun-sin's career, and especially the Battle of Myeongnyang, cannot be overstated. If he had lost that battle, if those 13 ships had been destroyed, the Japanese would have controlled the entire southern coast of Korea. Their armies would have been resupplied and reinforced by sea without opposition. The war, which was already dragging into its 6th year, would have continued far longer. Ming China, already stretched thin fighting on multiple fronts, might have made concessions or withdrawn support. Korea might have been partitioned, subjugated, or turned into a Japanese vassal state. But he didn't lose. He won with a combination of geographic knowledge, tactical brilliance, and sheer audacity. He understood that numbers don't matter if you can't use them. He turned the current and the narrow strait into his greatest weapons. He made every Japanese advantage, speed, firepower, numbers, irrelevant. And he did it with 13 broken ships and a crew of men who had every reason to believe they were about to die. His victory at Myeongnyang is studied in military academies around the world. It's taught as an example of how terrain and timing can overcome numerical superiority. It's analyzed as a case study in leadership under pressure. Commanders from every nation have studied his tactics and tried to apply the lessons to their own situations. The battle is considered one of the greatest naval victories in history, comparable to Salamis, Trafalgar, or Midway. But what makes his story truly remarkable is not just the battle. It's the context. He was betrayed by his own government. He was arrested, tortured, and humiliated. He was stripped of everything he had built and reduced to the rank of a common soldier. And when his country came crawling back to him, desperate and broken, he didn't refuse. He didn't take revenge. He took command of 13 ships and went back to war. He could have said no. He could have let Korea fall. He had every justification, every excuse, but he didn't. Because for Yi Sun-sin, duty was not conditional, loyalty was not transactional. He served his country not because they deserved it, but because it was who he was. And that, more than any tactical genius or battlefield victory, is why Yi is remembered as a hero. Admiral Yi Sun-sin is remembered in Korea as one of the greatest military commanders in history. Statues of him stand in Seoul and across the country. His face is on Korean currency. The turtle ships he commanded are symbols of national pride. Children learn his story in school. His famous declaration, "I still have 12 warships," is quoted as an example of courage and determination. He is not just a historical figure in Korea. He is a national symbol, a reminder of what one person can accomplish when they refuse to give up. But outside Korea, his story is barely known. Most people in the West have never heard of the Battle of Myeongnyang. They've never heard of Admiral Yi Sun-sin. They don't know about the man who won 23 consecutive naval battles and then, when all hope was lost, pulled off the most lopsided naval victory in history. His name doesn't appear in the popular histories. He's not taught in schools. He's not featured in movies or documentaries. This is why we tell these stories, because history is full of moments like this. Moments where everything should have ended in disaster, but didn't. Where one person with the right knowledge and the courage to act changed the course of nations. Where impossible became real. These stories matter because they remind us that the world we live in was shaped by individuals, by decisions made in the heat of battle, by leaders who refused to surrender when surrender was the rational choice. The Battle of Myeongnyang teaches us several lessons. First, numbers are not destiny. The side with more ships, more men, more resources doesn't always win. What matters is how those resources are used. He understood the geography of Myeongnyang strait better than the Japanese. He understood the current, the tide, the narrow waters. He turned the battlefield itself into a weapon. The Japanese had 330 ships, but in that strait, they could only use a dozen at a time. He neutralized their advantage with knowledge and preparation. Second, leadership matters. His men were terrified. They had every reason to believe they were going to die. but Yi stood on the deck of his flagship and advanced alone into the face of the enemy. That single act of courage galvanized his fleet. It shamed the hesitant captains into action. It showed the sailors that their admiral was not afraid, and if he was not afraid, neither should they be. Leadership is not about rank or title. It's about action. It's about being the first one into danger and the last one to retreat. Third, timing is everything. He could have fought the Japanese in open water. He could have tried to run or hide, but he knew that the only chance of victory was to fight in Myeongnyang strait at the exact moment when the tide turned. He waited for that moment. He bought time with his own blood, taking a musket ball to the shoulder while holding the Japanese at bay. And when the current reversed, he attacked with everything he had. The battle was won not just with cannons and courage, but with perfect timing. Fourth, never give up. He had been betrayed, tortured, and stripped of command. His fleet had been destroyed. His country was losing the war. He had 13 ships against 330. Any rational person would have looked at that situation and concluded it was hopeless. He didn't see it that way. He saw an opportunity. He saw a chance to turn the war around, and he took it. Giving up is easy. Fighting when the odds are against you is hard, but that's when it matters most. Admiral Yi Sun-sin fought with 13 ships and won. He was betrayed, broken, brought back, and he refused to surrender. He understood that leadership is not about having the most resources or the largest army. It's about making the right decisions at the right time. It's about knowing your battlefield better than your enemy. It's about inspiring your men to fight even when they're terrified. And it's about refusing to quit even when quitting is the only rational choice. That's the story, that's the miracle, and that's why it matters. If this story taught you something new, if it moved you, here's what I need. Hit that like button right now, drop a comment and tell me what you think. What other battles should we cover? What other forgotten heroes should we bring to light? Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're just getting started. We're building a community that values real history, no fluff, no shortcuts, just the stories that shaped the world. Admiral Yi Sun-sin, 13 ships, 330 enemies, one impossible victory. Remember that name, remember that battle. And remember that no matter how bad things look, no matter how hopeless the situation seems, there is always a way to fight back, always a way to win. You just have to be willing to stand your ground and refuse to break. That's the lesson of Myeongnyang. That's the legacy of Admiral Yi, and that's why we tell these stories.